The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Lady Louise. Windsor adjusted her simple navy dress and checked her reflection one final time. At 20 years old, she had grown into a poised young woman, but today felt different. The weight of expectations seemed heavier as she prepared to accompany her parents, the Earl and Countess of Wessex, to a series of important royal engagements. Lady Louise had always preferred staying in the background. Unlike her cousins, who seemed to thrive in the spotlight, she found comfort in the quieter aspects of royal life. Her passion for carriage driving, inherited from her grandfather Prince Philip, kept her grounded and connected to tradition without the overwhelming pressure of constant, public scrutiny as she walked through the castle corridors. Lady Louise encountered Mrs. Margaret Hartwell, the head of protocol, who was briefing junior staff members about the day's events. The conversation stopped abruptly when Louise approached, and she noticed the uncomfortable silence that followed. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell," Louise said with a warm smile, inclining her head slightly in the traditional greeting she had been taught since childhood. Mrs. Hartwell's response was formal, but notably cool. "Lady Louise, I trust you're prepared for today's engagements," her tone suggested. Something more than professional courtesy was at stake. Louise felt the tension immediately, but chose not to address it directly. She had learned from her mother that sometimes the best approach was to lead by example rather than confrontation. "Of course. Is there anything specific I should be aware of?" The protocol officer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Just remember that certain standards must be maintained, particularly given the current discussions about the monarchy's future direction." The comment stung more than Louise expected. She understood the implication perfectly. There had been whispers throughout the royal household about which family members truly understood their roles and responsibilities. Some staff members had begun treating the working royals differently, creating an unofficial hierarchy that went beyond official precedents. Louise excused herself gracefully and continued toward the private family quarters, where her parents were waiting. The Earl of Wessex was reviewing his notes for a veterans' charity event, while the Countess was on a phone call with their private secretary about upcoming engagements. "Ready, darling?" her mother asked, ending the call and gathering her belongings. "Yes. But I think we might have some challenges today," Louise replied. Explaining her encounter with Mrs. Hartwell, her father looked up from his papers with concern. "I've noticed some tension among the household staff lately. There seems to be some confusion about protocol changes and how they affect different family members." The Countess sighed deeply. "It's been building for months. Ever since the discussions about streamlining the monarchy began, some people have started making their own judgments about who matters and who doesn't. As they made their way to the first engagement, Louise couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched and judged more critically than usual. The car ride to the Veterans Center was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts about the changing dynamics within the royal institution. At the Veterans Center, Louise immediately felt more at ease. The genuine warmth and respect from the veterans and staff reminded her why she valued public service. An elderly veteran named Harold approached her with obvious delight. "Lady Louise, I was hoping you'd be here today. I wanted to thank you personally for the letter you sent after my grandson's deployment ended. It meant more to my family than you could know." Louise's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Harold, it's wonderful to see you again. How is James adjusting to civilian life?" Their conversation was interrupted by a photographer from a major newspaper who had been documenting the event. "Excuse me, Lady Louise, could we get a photo of you with some of the veterans?" Before Louise could respond, Mrs. Hartwell appeared at her elbow. "I'm afraid Lady Louise won't be available for photographs today. Perhaps you could focus on the Earl and Countess instead." Louise felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The veterans looked confused and disappointed, and she could see Harold's expression change from joy to bewilderment. The photographer shrugged and moved away, but the damage was done. "I'd be happy to take photos with the veterans," Louise said firmly, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. Mrs. Hartwell's jaw tightened. "I don't think that's appropriate, given current protocol guidelines." "Which guidelines specifically?" Louise asked, her tone remaining respectful but determined. I wasn't aware that showing respect for our veterans had become inappropriate. The confrontation was subtle, but unmistakable. Other staff members had stopped their conversations to watch, and Louise realized this moment would likely be discussed throughout the royal household within hours. Harold stepped forward, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he said to Mrs. Hartwell, "but Lady Louise has always been welcome here. These men and women serve their country, and they appreciate when the royal family takes time to acknowledge that service." The tension in the room was palpable. Louise could see her parents across the room, engaged in conversation but clearly aware that something significant was happening. She had a choice to make: back down and maintain the peace, or stand her ground and risk further complications. "Harold's right," Louise said quietly but clearly. "I came here to show my respect and gratitude to people who have sacrificed for our country. I won't be prevented from doing that by arbitrary interpretations of protocol." She walked toward the group of veterans, and one by one, they gathered around her. The photographer, who had been watching the exchange, began taking pictures. Mrs. Hartwell stood frozen, clearly unsure how to handle a situation where a junior royal was directly challenging her authority, as Louise spent the next hour genuinely engaging with the veterans, listening to their stories and showing sincere interest in their experiences. Something shifted in the room. Staff members who had been watching began to smile and relax. The veterans responded to her authenticity with obvious affection and respect. By the time they were ready to leave, Louise had unknowingly set something in motion. Her quiet act of defiance hadn't gone unnoticed, and word was already beginning to spread throughout the network of royal staff and observers about the young woman who had stood up for what she believed was right. The ride back to Windsor was different. From the morning journey, there was a sense of anticipation in the air, as if everyone understood that something important had begun. News of the Veterans Center incident spread through the royal household faster than Louise had anticipated. By the following morning, she could sense the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. The atmosphere at Windsor had become charged with an undercurrent of tension that made even routine activities feel significant. Louise was in the castle's library, researching material for an upcoming speech about youth engagement in traditional crafts, when James Morrison, one of the younger equerries, approached her with obvious nervousness. "Lady Louise, I hope you don't mind me saying, but what you did yesterday was brilliant," he said, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Some of the staff have been talking, and not everyone agrees with how Mrs. Hartwell has been handling things lately." Louise looked up from her books, surprised by his directness. "I wasn't trying to cause trouble, James. I simply felt that preventing me from interacting with the veterans was wrong." "That's exactly why people are talking," James continued, his voice dropping lower. "There's been a lot of confusion about the new direction things are supposed to take. Some of the senior staff seem to think they need to decide who's important and who isn't, rather than following actual protocol." Before Louise could respond, the library door opened and Mrs. Hartwell entered with two other senior staff members. The conversation with James ended abruptly as he excused himself, but Louise noticed the meaningful look he gave her before leaving. "Lady Louise," Mrs. Hartwell said, her tone even more formal than usual, "I need to discuss yesterday's events with you." Louise closed her book and gave Mrs. Hartwell her full attention. "Of course. Please, sit down." The protocol officer remained standing, clearly intending to establish her authority. "I've received several inquiries from the press office about the photographs from yesterday's engagement. There are questions about whether your interactions were approved through proper channels." "My interactions with British veterans who have served their country?" Louise asked, keeping her voice level despite her growing frustration. "I wasn't aware that required special approval beyond what was given for the entire family's attendance." "The situation is more complex than you might understand," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "There are broader considerations about the royal family's public image and the strategic direction of royal engagements." Louise felt a flash of anger but controlled it carefully. "Are you suggesting that showing respect to veterans damages the royal family's image?" The question hung in the air between them. One of the other staff members shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the impossible position Mrs. Hartwell had created for herself. "I'm suggesting," Mrs. Hartwell said slowly, that individual family members need to be more conscious of their place within the overall structure of royal duties. The implication was clear, and Louise felt something harden inside her chest. She had always been taught that service was the foundation of royal duty, not hierarchy or personal advancement. "I understand my place perfectly," Louise said, rising from her chair with quiet dignity. "My place is to serve the people of this country with respect, authenticity, and dedication. If that conflicts with someone's interpretation of protocol, then perhaps the interpretation needs to be reconsidered." The confrontation might have escalated further. But the library door opened again to admit the Countess of Wessex. Louise's mother took in the scene immediately, her experienced eye recognizing the tension. "Good morning," the Countess said pleasantly. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope there's nothing urgent. Louise and I have an appointment to review the arrangements for next week's textile exhibition." Mrs. Hartwell clearly wanted to continue the conversation, but couldn't ignore the polite dismissal. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. We can discuss this matter later." After the staff members left, Louise's mother closed the library door and turned to her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, settling into one of the comfortable reading chairs. Louise recounted both the previous day's events and the morning's confrontation. Her mother listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or frowning at particular details. "You handled yourself well," the Countess said finally. "But you should know that this situation extends far beyond Mrs. Hartwell's personal opinions. There are genuine questions being raised about the future role of different family members, and some people are interpreting that as license to make their own judgments." Louise asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Her mother sighed deeply. Questions about which family members should have prominent public roles, how resources should be allocated, and what the public expects from a modern monarchy. Some people have decided that means certain family members matter more than others. Louise felt a mix of hurt and determination. "And they've decided I don't matter? They've decided you're an easy target because you've always been content to stay in the background," her mother replied. "But what they don't understand is that your approach to royal duty, quiet, genuine, focused on service rather than spotlight, is exactly what the country needs." That afternoon, Louise had a scheduled visit to a local school, where she was to speak with students about the importance of traditional skills in modern life. As they prepared to leave Windsor, she noticed that the usual complement of staff seemed smaller than normal during the car ride. Her protection officer mentioned that several staff members had requested to be assigned to other duties that day. The message was clear. Some people were distancing themselves from what they perceived as a problematic member of the royal family at the school. However, Louise discovered something entirely different. The headmistress greeted her with unusual warmth, and several teachers mentioned that they had seen the photographs from the Veterans Center with appreciation. "It's wonderful to see a young royal who genuinely connects with people," said Mrs. Patterson, who taught history. "The students are excited to meet someone they feel they can relate to." The visit exceeded all expectations. Louise found herself energized by the students' genuine curiosity and enthusiasm. They asked thoughtful questions about balancing tradition with innovation, and she found herself sharing insights that surprised even her with their depth and clarity. One student, a 15-year-old named Emma, approached her after the formal presentation. "Lady Louise, my grandfather is a veteran, and he showed me the photos from yesterday. He said it reminded him of why he was proud to serve." Louise felt tears spring to her eyes unexpectedly. "Thank you for telling me that, Emma. Please give your grandfather my regards." As they prepared to leave, the headmistress pulled Louise aside. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you have a natural gift for connecting with people. Whatever challenges you might be facing elsewhere, please know that you're making a real difference in communities like ours." The drive back to Windsor was quiet, but Louise felt something new stirring within her. The criticism and attempts to marginalize her were painful, but they were also clarifying. She was beginning to understand that the choice wasn't between causing trouble and avoiding conflict. The choice was between being true to her understanding of royal duty or allowing others to define her role for their own purposes. That evening, as she prepared for dinner, Louise made a decision that would shape everything that followed. She would not retreat or compromise on her principles. But she would also not allow the situation to escalate into destructive conflict. Instead, she would demonstrate through her actions what she believed royal service should look like. The question was whether the royal household was ready for that kind of demonstration. The textile exhibition opening was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Louise threw herself into the preparation with renewed energy. She spent hours learning about each artisan who would be featured, studying the historical significance of their crafts, and preparing thoughtful questions that would help visitors understand the cultural importance of traditional skills. Her dedication did not go unnoticed. Sarah Chen, the exhibition coordinator, was impressed by Louise's thorough preparation and genuine enthusiasm for the subject matter. "I've worked with many royal patrons over the years," Sarah confided during one of their planning sessions. "But I've rarely seen someone take such personal interest in understanding the deeper meaning behind what we're showcasing." Louise felt a warmth at the compliment, but her pleasure was dampened when she overheard two senior household staff members discussing the event in disparaging terms. "It's a waste of resources," one was saying to the other. "All this effort for someone who isn't even going to have a significant role going forward." The comment stung, but it also strengthened Louise's resolve. If people were going to judge her contributions as worthless, she would prove them wrong through the quality of her work and the impact of her engagements. On the day of the exhibition opening, Louise arrived early to do a final walkthrough with Sarah. The gallery had been transformed into a celebration of British craftsmanship, with demonstrations by master weavers, potters, and metalworkers arranged throughout the space as Louise moved from station to station, speaking with each artisan and learning about their techniques. She was unaware that her interactions were being carefully observed. James Morrison, the young equerry who had approached her in the library, was documenting the visit and taking notes on her engagement style. "Lady Louise," called out Margaret Thornton, a weaver from the Cotswolds, who was demonstrating traditional techniques on an antique loom. "Would you like to try a few passes with the shuttle?" Louise's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "I'd be honored, but I should warn you that my experience is limited to what my grandmother taught me years ago," as Louise carefully worked the shuttle through the warp threads. Margaret was struck by her natural aptitude and respectful approach to the craft. "You have good hands for this," she said approvingly. "Your grandmother taught you well." The moment was interrupted by Mrs. Hartwell's arrival with a photographer from the official royal photographer's office. "Lady Louise, we need to move along. There are other demonstrations to see, and we're running behind schedule." Louise looked up from the loom, reluctant to cut short her conversation with Margaret. "Could we have just a few more minutes?" Margaret was explaining how the patterns carry family histories, and I think visitors would find that fascinating. "The schedule must be maintained," Mrs. Hartwell insisted, her tone brooking no argument. But Margaret Thornton was not easily intimidated. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but this young lady is learning something important here. The royal family has always supported our crafts, and Lady Louise understands that support means more than just showing up for photographs." The photographer, sensing the tension, began taking pictures of Louise at the loom. The images captured her complete absorption in the process and her genuine connection with Margaret, creating exactly the kind of authentic moment that Mrs. Hartwell seemed determined to prevent. "These crafts are disappearing because people don't take time to understand their value," Louise said, addressing both Margaret and the photographer. "If my presence here can help people appreciate the skill and history involved, then every minute is well spent." Mrs. Hartwell's frustration was evident, but she couldn't argue with Louise's reasoning without appearing to dismiss the very purpose of the exhibition. She stepped back, clearly planning to address the matter later. As the official opening began and visitors started arriving, Louise's approach became even more apparent. While other royal family members might have moved through the gallery with polite but distant interest, Louise engaged deeply with both the artisans and the visitors. She helped translate technical explanations for children, encouraged teenagers to try their hand at various crafts, and listened thoughtfully to elderly visitors who shared memories of family members who had worked in traditional trades. Professor David Whitmore, a cultural historian who had helped organize the exhibition, was amazed by Louise's impact. "She's not just visiting," he observed to Sarah Chen. She's creating connections between the crafts, the artisans, and the community. This is exactly what cultural preservation should look like. The turning point came when a group of university students arrived for a special presentation. They had come expecting a typical royal appearance, found themselves drawn into genuine conversations about the relevance of traditional skills in contemporary life. One student, studying design at Central St. Martin's, challenged Louise directly. "With respect, Lady Louise, isn't this all just nostalgia? Shouldn't we be focusing on innovation rather than preserving outdated techniques?" Instead of deflecting the question, Louise welcomed the challenge. "That's exactly the right question to ask," she said, moving to a display that showed traditional weaving patterns alongside modern textile designs. "But look at this evidence. These traditional techniques aren't outdated, they're foundational. Modern sustainable design is actually returning to principles that these crafts never abandoned." She spent the next 20 minutes in animated discussion with the students, drawing connections between historical techniques and contemporary environmental concerns, between traditional apprenticeship systems and modern education challenges, between cultural preservation and innovation. The students were captivated, and several asked for her contact information to continue the conversation. One young woman, studying sustainable fashion, was particularly impressed. "I came here because my professor required it," she admitted to Louise. "But you've completely changed how I think about traditional skills. Could I possibly arrange to visit some of these artisans' workshops?" Louise immediately turned to Sarah Chen and Margaret Thornton to help arrange the connection. Her genuine enthusiasm for linking people with learning opportunities was infectious. And soon several other students were making similar requests. By the end of the event, word had spread through social media about the unexpected depth and engagement of Louise's presentation. Videos of her conversations with students began circulating online, tagged with comments about authentic royal engagement, and finally, a royal who gets it. Mrs. Hartwell watched this development with obvious displeasure. The success of the event and the positive response to Louise's approach was making her previous criticisms look petty and short-sighted as they prepared to leave. Sarah Chen approached Louise with obvious emotion. "I can't thank you enough for today. You didn't just open our exhibition, you transformed it into something that will continue to create connections and opportunities long after today." Louise felt a deep satisfaction. That had nothing to do with public relations or official recognition. This was what royal service felt like when it was done right, creating genuine value and lasting positive impact. But as they returned to Windsor, she knew that the success of the day would likely intensify rather than resolve the underlying tensions. People who had been determined to marginalize her would now have to confront the evidence that her approach to royal duty was not only effective, but superior to the sterile, distant alternatives they preferred. The question was whether they would acknowledge that evidence, or double down on their opposition. Louise suspected she was about to find out. The response to the textile exhibition exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 48 hours, the royal family's social media accounts were flooded with positive comments about Louise's engagement, and several major newspapers ran features about her approach to royal duties. The Guardian's headline read, "Lady Louise Windsor, a masterclass in modern royal service," while the Times focused on her ability to connect with young people. But the success brought unexpected consequences. Louise arrived at Windsor on Thursday morning to find Mrs. Hartwell waiting for her with a formal-looking document and an expression that suggested serious displeasure. "Lady Louise, I need to discuss some concerns that have been raised about recent events," Mrs. Hartwell began. Gesturing for Louise to sit across from her in the castle's morning room, Louise settled into the chair, maintaining her composure despite the obvious confrontational setup. "What kind of concerns?" "There are questions about whether your recent public appearances have been properly coordinated with the overall royal communication strategy," Mrs. Hartwell said, consulting the document. "Some people feel that independent initiatives, however well-intentioned, can create confusion about official royal positions." The accusation was so unexpected that Louise needed a moment to process it. "Are you suggesting that supporting British artisans and encouraging young people to appreciate traditional crafts conflicts with royal policy. I'm suggesting that individual family members making unplanned statements about cultural preservation and education policy might undermine coordinated royal messaging," Mrs. Hartwell replied stiffly. Louise felt a surge of incredulity. "I wasn't making policy statements. I was engaging with people about subjects I cared deeply about and know something about." "The distinction may not be clear to the public," Mrs. Hartwell countered, "when a member of the royal family speaks passionately about specific issues. People assume those represent official royal positions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, who knocked hesitantly before entering. "Excuse me, Mrs. Hartwell, but there's an urgent call from the press office about the university students who have been contacting various royal charities since Tuesday's event." Mrs. Hartwell's expression darkened. "What about them?" James glanced at Louise before responding. "Apparently, several universities are requesting similar engagement events, and there are inquiries about whether Lady Louise might visit their design and cultural studies programs. The press office wants to know how to respond. Tell them that schedules are coordinated through proper channels and that individual requests cannot be accommodated," Mrs. Hartwell said dismissively. Louise felt something snap inside her. "Excuse me, but shouldn't those decisions be made by the family members involved, rather than arbitrarily dismissed?" Mrs. Hartwell turned to face Louise directly. "Lady Louise, I think you misunderstand your position within the royal hierarchy. These kinds of decisions are made by people who understand the broader implications." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Louise felt her patience finally reaching its limit. "I understand my position perfectly. What I don't understand is why supporting education and cultural preservation has become controversial." James Morrison stood frozen between the two women, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating tension. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Perhaps I should mention that the Earl and Countess of Wessex would like to see Lady Louise in their private study when convenient." Louise rose immediately, grateful for the interruption. "Please tell my parents I'll be right there." As she left the morning room, she heard Mrs. Hartwell speaking in low, urgent tones to James about managing expectations and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Louise found her parents in their study, reviewing correspondence and looking unusually serious. The Earl of Wessex gestured for her to join them at a small conference table where newspapers were spread out alongside official-looking documents. "Need to talk about what's been happening?" her mother said gently but firmly. "These positive responses to your recent engagements have created some unexpected reactions." Louise felt a chill. What kind of reactions? Her father exchanged glances with her mother before responding. "There are people within the household who feel that your individual success reflects poorly on the overall coordination of royal activities. They're concerned that you're operating outside established protocols." "But I'm not operating outside protocols," Louise protested. "I'm doing exactly what I've always been taught, serving the public with sincerity and dedication." "We know that," the Countess assured her. "But there's a broader context you need to understand. There are ongoing discussions about restructuring royal duties, and some people interpret your recent visibility as an attempt to position yourself more prominently." Louise felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "I never asked for more prominence. I just did what felt right in each situation." "That's precisely the problem from their perspective," the Earl explained. "Your natural approach to royal duty is so effective that it makes other approaches look inadequate by comparison." The Countess leaned forward with obvious concern. "Louise, we're incredibly proud of you, and we think your instincts about royal service are absolutely correct. But you need to understand that your success is threatening to people who have invested in different approaches." Louise absorbed this information with growing dismay. "So what are you telling me? That I should be less engaged? Less authentic? Less effective?" "We're telling you that there are forces at work that go beyond your individual choices," her father replied. "There are people who would prefer that certain family members maintain lower profiles, and they're using your recent success to argue that you're not following their preferred direction." "What kind of forces?" Louise asked, though she suspected she already knew. Her mother sighed deeply. "There are consultants and advisors who believe the monarchy's future depends on having a smaller, more controlled public presence. They see someone like you, genuine, engaging, effective at connecting with people, as a complication rather than an asset. Louise felt a mix of hurt and anger. So my crime is being good at royal duties? Your crime is being good at royal duties in a way that makes their preferred approach look inadequate, the Earl said with a slight smile despite the seriousness of the above conversation. The Countess reached across the table to take Louise's hand. We want you to know that we support you completely. Your approach to royal service represents the best of what this institution can offer. But we also need you to be aware that you're going to face increasing pressure to conform to other people's expectations. Louise felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders. She could retreat, accept the limitations that others wanted to place on her, and avoid further conflict. Or she could continue following her instincts about what royal service should look like, knowing that it would likely lead to more confrontations. What would you do in my position? She asked her parents. The Earl and Countess exchanged another meaningful look before her mother responded. We would remember that the monarchy exists to serve the people, not to serve the convenience of advisors and protocol officers. We would remember that authenticity and genuine service are more valuable than artificial harmony. Louise felt something crystallize within her chest. The choice was becoming clear, even if the path forward remained uncertain. She would not compromise her understanding of what royal duty meant, regardless of the consequences. That evening, as she prepared for bed, Louise received an unexpected message from James Morrison. The university students from the textile exhibition had organized themselves into a group called Traditional Skills Tomorrow and were requesting a formal meeting to discuss how royal patronage might support their initiatives. For the first time in days, Louise smiled with genuine pleasure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, there were people who understood and appreciated what she was trying to accomplish. That knowledge would have to be enough to sustain her through whatever came next. The confrontation Louise had been expecting came the following Monday morning. She arrived at Windsor to find not just Mrs. Hartwell waiting for her, but also Sir Christopher Whitley, one of the most senior household officials, and to people she didn't recognize who were introduced as communications consultants. The meeting was held in the formal conference room, and the setup immediately made Louise understand that this was intended to be more than a casual discussion. Sir Christopher gestured for her to take a seat across from the group, creating an unmistakably adversarial dynamic. Lady Louise, Sir Christopher began in his most official tone. We need to address some serious concerns about the direction of your recent public engagements. Louise maintained her composure, drawing on years of royal training. I'm listening. One of the consultants, a sharp-faced woman in her 40s, opened a tablet and began reading from what was obviously a prepared statement. Our analysis of public response to recent royal activities shows some concerning patterns. Individual family members generating independent media attention can create confusion about official royal messaging and potentially undermine coordinated communication strategies. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, designed to make Louise's authentic engagement with the public sound like a communications problem rather than a success. Louise felt her temper rising but kept her voice level. Could you be more specific about what concerns you? Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward with obvious satisfaction. The textile exhibition generated significant social media discussion that wasn't coordinated through proper channels. The university students group that formed afterward is now claiming royal endorsement for their activities. And there are multiple requests for similar events that we haven't approved. Louise felt as if she were being criticized for succeeding too well. So the problem is that people responded positively to royal engagement with education and cultural preservation. The problem, the second consultant interjected, is that individual royal family members creating their own narrative around specific issues can conflict with broader institutional messaging. Sir Christopher nodded gravely. There are also concerns about resource allocation and the appropriate distribution of royal attention across different charitable and cultural areas. Realized with growing anger that this wasn't really about protocol or communications. This was about control. These people were threatened by the fact that her authentic approach to royal duty was more effective than their carefully managed alternatives. "I'd like to understand something," Louise said, her voice becoming more formal. "Are you suggesting that engaging genuinely with the public and supporting worthwhile causes is inappropriate?" "We're suggesting," Mrs. Hartwell replied with barely concealed satisfaction, "that there need to be clearer boundaries around individual initiatives, particularly for family members whose roles may be changing in the future." The implication hung in the air like a threat. Louise understood perfectly: conform to their preferred approach, or risk being marginalized even further. "And what exactly would these clearer boundaries look like?" Louise asked. The first consultant referred to her tablet again. "We recommend that future public engagements focus on pre-approved themes with carefully scripted interactions. Individual family members should avoid making statements that could be interpreted as personal policy positions." Louise felt something cold settle in her stomach. They were essentially asking her to become a robot, going through the motions of royal duty without any genuine engagement or personal investment. "In other words," Louise said slowly, "you want me to be less effective at connecting with people." Sir Christopher shifted uncomfortably. "We want you to be more mindful of your role within the broader institutional framework." Louise stood up, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what royal service means." The room went completely silent. Mrs. Hartwell's eyes widened slightly, and Louise could see that they hadn't expected direct resistance. "Royal service," Louise continued, her voice gaining strength, "exists to benefit the people of this country, not to make things convenient for communications consultants. When I engage with veterans or students or artisans, I'm not pursuing a personal agenda. I'm doing exactly what members of the royal family are supposed to do." "Lady Louise," Sir Christopher began, but she held up her hand. "I'm not finished. You're asking me to choose between being effective at royal duty and being compliant with your preferred management style? That's not a choice I'm willing to make." Mrs. Hartwell found her voice. "You seem to be forgetting that there are consequences for refusing to work within established frameworks." Louise turned to look at her directly. "What kind of consequences?" "Reduced support for future engagements, limited access to royal resources, and questions about whether continued public activities are appropriate." Mrs. Hartwell replied with obvious relish. Louise felt a moment of real fear. They were threatening to essentially end her public role unless she agreed to become a hollow version of herself. But then she remembered Harold at the Veterans Center and Margaret at the textile exhibition, and the university students who were organizing to preserve traditional skills. "I understand," Louise said calmly. "You're telling me that I can continue to represent the royal family, but only if I agree to do it badly?" The accusation struck home. Sir Christopher looked deeply uncomfortable, and even the consultants seemed to realize how their position sounded when stated so directly. "That's not how we would characterize it," the second consultant said weakly. "How would you characterize it?" Louise asked. "You want me to limit my effectiveness, reduce my authenticity, and distance myself from causes I care about. In exchange, you'll allow me to continue going through the motions of royal duty. Is that accurate?" No one answered, which was answer enough. Louise gathered her composure and moved toward the door. "I need some time to consider my options." As she reached the door, Sir Christopher spoke up. "Lady Louise, I hope you'll remember that compromise is often necessary for the greater good of the institution." Louise turned back to face the room. "And I hope you'll remember that institutions exist to serve people, not the other way around. The monarchy's strength comes from its connection to the public, not from the convenience of its management." She left the room knowing that she had probably just declared war on the very people who controlled her future within the royal family. But she also knew that compromising her principles wouldn't actually preserve her role. It would just turn her into a puppet. That afternoon, Louise received an unexpected visitor. Princess Anne arrived at Windsor and requested a private conversation. As they walked through the castle gardens, Louise's aunt listened carefully to the morning's events without interruption. "They tried something similar with me 40 years ago," Princess Anne said finally. "Different people, same basic approach. They wanted me to be more suitable for their vision of royal duty." Louise looked at her aunt with surprise. "What did you do?" Princess Anne smiled grimly. "I told them that if they wanted a ceremonial figurehead, they should hire an actress. If they wanted a working member of the royal family, they'd have to accept that I intended to actually work." Did they back down? "Eventually, but not before trying to make things very difficult for me." Princess Anne stopped walking and faced Louise directly. "The question you need to answer is whether you're prepared for a real fight, because that's what this is going to be." Louise felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders again. "What would happen if I just gave them what they want?" "You'd become irrelevant," Princess Anne replied bluntly. "They'd use you when convenient and ignore you when not. You'd spend the rest of your life wondering what you might have accomplished if you'd had the courage to be yourself." As they walked back toward the castle, Louise realized that the choice had already been made. She wouldn't compromise her understanding of what royal service meant, regardless of the cost. 3 months later, Louise stood in the same conference room where she had faced down the consultants and palace officials. But everything had changed. The room was filled with representatives from universities, arts organizations, veteran groups, and youth charities, all gathered for the inaugural meeting of the traditional skills. Tomorrow Foundation Sir Christopher Whitley sat at the far end of the table, looking distinctly uncomfortable, but undeniably present. Mrs. Hartwell was notably absent, having requested a transfer to other duties after what had become known throughout the royal household as the Louise situation. Transformation had not been easy or immediate. For several weeks after her confrontation with the palace officials, Louise had found herself increasingly isolated. Scheduled engagements were mysteriously canceled. Staff support became minimal. She faced constant subtle pressure to reconsider her position. But the public response to her approach had continued to grow. The university students' Traditional Skills Tomorrow group had evolved into a national movement, with chapters forming at colleges across the country. Veterans organizations had begun specifically requesting Louise's presence at their events. Museums and cultural institutions were reaching out directly to her parents' office, asking for her involvement in preservation and education programs. More importantly, other members of the royal family had begun to take notice. Prince William had quietly expressed support for her approach during a family gathering, noting that authentic engagement was exactly what the monarchy needed to remain relevant. The Princess of Wales had made a point of asking Louise's advice about her own upcoming cultural engagements. The turning point had come when King Charles himself had requested a private meeting with Louise. She had expected a lecture about family unity and institutional loyalty. Instead, she found herself in a 2-hour conversation about the future of royal service and the importance of genuine connection with the public. "Your instincts are absolutely correct," the king had told her. "The monarchy's strength has always come from its ability to serve people meaningfully, not from its ability to avoid controversy or inconvenience." He had then made a decision that surprised everyone. Louise would be given formal responsibility for youth engagement and cultural preservation. With her own office and proper staff support, the consultants who had tried to limit her activities were quietly reassigned to other duties. Now, as Louise looked around the room at the faces of people who shared her passion for meaningful public service, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with positive impact. "Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Traditional Skills Tomorrow Foundation," she began, her voice carrying a confidence that had been hard-won over the previous months. 6 months ago, this was just an idea born from conversations between students and artisans. Today, we're launching a national initiative to preserve cultural knowledge and connect it to contemporary innovation. Professor David Whitmore, who had observed her transformation since the textile exhibition, smiled with obvious pride. The foundation represented everything he had hoped royal patronage could accomplish when it was done right. Margaret Thornton, the weaver from the Cotswolds, raised her hand. "Lady Louise, I want to thank you for not giving up when things got difficult. There were rumors that you might step back from this kind of work." Louise met her gaze directly. There were certainly pressures to take a different approach, but stepping back would have meant abandoning principles that I believe are fundamental to what royal service should be. James Morrison, who had been promoted to serve as Louise's private secretary, presented the foundation's first-year objectives. They included establishing apprenticeship programs, creating educational partnerships with universities, developing sustainable funding models, and building connections between traditional crafts and contemporary design industries. Harold, the veteran who had first welcomed Louise at the Veterans Center, spoke up from his seat. "Can you tell us how this foundation will work with military heritage preservation?" Louise's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "That's one of our priority areas. We're developing partnerships with regimental museums and military charities to document and preserve traditional military crafts, everything from ceremonial uniform techniques to historical weaponry restoration." Discussion that followed was exactly what Louise had envisioned. When she first refused to compromise her approach to royal duty, instead of sterile, scripted interactions, she was engaged in substantive conversations about real problems and practical solutions. Sir Christopher, who had initially opposed Louise's approach so strongly, found himself taking notes and asking thoughtful questions. The success of her model was undeniable, and even former skeptics were beginning to understand its value. As the meeting concluded and participants began to file out, several people approached Louise with additional ideas and offers of support. The energy in the room was infectious, and Louise realized that this was what royal service felt like when it was done right, creating genuine value that extended far beyond any individual engagement. Sarah Chen, the exhibition coordinator who had first recognized Louise's potential, lingered after the others had left. "I have to ask, was it worth it? The confrontation, the pressure, the uncertainty?" Louise considered the question seriously. "It was necessary. If I had compromised my understanding of what royal service should be, none of this would exist. We'd have had nice, safe, forgettable events that satisfied the consultants but didn't help anyone." Princess Anne, who had attended the meeting as an observer, approached with her characteristic directness. "You've proven something important here. Royal duty doesn't require choosing between effectiveness and appropriateness. It requires having the courage to be effective appropriately." As Louise prepared to leave Windsor that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The confrontation with palace officials had been painful and frightening, but it had forced her to articulate and defend her principles in ways that ultimately strengthened both her understanding and her resolve. The traditional Skills Tomorrow Foundation represented more than just a successful initiative. It represented a model for how royal service could work in the modern era by refusing to accept artificial limitations on her effectiveness. Louise had demonstrated that authentic engagement was not only possible but superior to managed alternatives. More importantly, she had shown that standing up for genuine principles, even when it created temporary conflict, could ultimately strengthen the institution she served. The monarchy was more relevant and more respected because it included people who were willing to serve effectively rather than just conveniently. As her car pulled away from Windsor Castle, Louise saw James Morrison waiting with a folder full of new requests and opportunities. Universities, charities, and cultural organizations across the country were reaching out, hoping to work with someone who had proven that royal service could be both principled and practical. The confrontation that had threatened to end her public role had instead transformed it into something far more meaningful than anyone had originally imagined. By refusing to compromise on authenticity, Louise had created space for the kind of royal service that actually served people rather than just serving the institution's preference for avoiding difficult conversations. The Foundation's work would continue to grow and evolve, but the principle it represented was now firmly established. Royal duty at its best required the courage to be genuinely effective, regardless of whether that effectiveness created complications for people who preferred simpler approaches. Louise smiled as she reviewed the evening's correspondence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate what royal service could accomplish when it was approached with both sincerity and determination. She was ready for whatever came next.